welcome to All Things Moore County, Moore County's weekly radio show highlighting the many facets of the Sandhills. That includes real estate, lifestyle, community and neighborhoods. And now from 4 Properties, here's your host, Bill Sahadi.
Good morning. Dorothy, we have I'm delighted to have Peggy Grande in with us today as our guest.
I see.
Peggy is in town to speak at the Reagan dinner at the Members Club sponsored by the Moore County Republican Party.
Yes.
She spent 10 years working as the executive assistant to Ronald Reagan.
Oh, wow.
For 10 years after he left office. And she wrote a book, which I want to talk about briefly before I introduce her, entitled The President Will See You Now. She was a senior at Pepperdine University when she interviewed as an intern and had admired him from afar and was kind of a starstruck college graduate who went through a 5-year hands-on phase working with directly with Ronald Reagan, and then a transitional period from 1994 and 1995 on when the first signs of Alzheimer's set in. We're a couple of days away from Valentine's Day, and in an indirect way, well, this book is a love story, and it's a story about a man that she had and still does have great admiration for, and the life lessons that he left her with that has translated down into her 4 children. And in reading the book, it was a page-turner. I couldn't put it down. It was not political.
Well, that's good.
The life lessons that you gather from reading the book slow your breathing. In our day and age today, with all the social media, the instant news, it kind of took me back to a time of maybe more civility, more kindness. You know, the Republicans and the Democrats in those days, they talked to each other.
Yeah.
Ronald Reagan was liked and admired by people of all different political persuasions. He had a gift. It's something a lot of people today long for.
Yeah.
And the timing of your talk, Peggy, today, and the fact that you could come in and talk to us about this book couldn't be better. So I want to say good morning and thanks so much for coming in.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me today.
This book is it's a story about Ronald Reagan, but it's also a story about you, isn't it?
It is. How an ordinary girl wound up in an extraordinary place and was able to serve a man like this. It's kind of an only in America story. You know, his truly was. He was born to a very poor family. His father was an alcoholic and basically a wide spot in the middle of the road in central Illinois during the Great Depression, and how his story could evolve into one that is known around the world is truly remarkable. And I feel in such a small way to also have an only in America story that a girl from Southern California could wind up at the feet of greatness.
How did you come to get the courage to even apply for the intern position that you eventually got? You were a senior in college, and you didn't know what you were going to do.
No, I didn't. I was working for Nordstrom at the time,
Yeah.
the fashion retailer. I loved that job. I'd probably still be at Nordstrom today had I not intersected the life of the president. But I was always that little kid who was fascinated and just completely obsessed probably with politics and presidents and government. And I had no family tie or connection to that, so I don't know, what draws anybody to a certain fascination. But growing up in Southern California, especially being a girl back in the day, that was highly unusual. And I never knew that it would be something that my life would intersect with. It was more of a hobby or a sidelight. But I was raised by a dad who taught me to believe that somebody's got to have the job you want, and it might as well be you. So I was a communications major at Pepperdine University. The great communicator, of course, was in the White House. Right. And here was this man who was a perfect example of everything that I loved and admired. And he was moving back to Los Angeles. He was a great example of not only the politics, but a person of faith and principle and character. And he was going to be just down the road from me. So I took a chance and I wrote a letter, old school, typed up a letter, mailed it in, was called into the office of Ronald Reagan to interview for what I thought would be a very short-term internship. I was hired practically on the spot for a short-term role. And at the end of that internship, the woman who hired me returned to Washington, D.C., and they asked me to take over her job, which was as the executive assistant to the chief of staff. And I served in that capacity for a few years until Ronald Reagan's longtime executive assistant he had since before he was governor retired, and they asked me to take that role.
You mention in the book how, and in some of your speeches to college students and such, how people, when they meet a celebrity, can be disappointed or let down. Yeah. For you, it was just the opposite after you met Ronald Reagan.
Yeah. Ronald Reagan's one of those few people I would think that is somebody, regardless of how high the pedestal is that you have put him on, when you meet him in person, he's even better than you imagined. And, living in LA, we have lots of star and celebrity sightings and a lot of people you maybe admire from afar, and then you meet them and it's sort of disappointing, and they're either not polite or just they're not what you expected them to be. But Ronald Reagan was exactly the opposite, and I had the great opportunity of having a front row seat to his life for over a decade, and just got to admire and appreciate the goodness of and the character of that man even more the more I knew him.
When did you think you were going to write the book, and why did you decide to do it now?
Yeah. Well, back to your opening point that you were making, there is this feeling, there's a longing for civility in our politics and in our personal lives. I actually never intended to write a book. When you're given a position of proximity like that, there's a certain sense of stewardship and privacy that you feel like comes with that. But a couple of years ago, I was speaking at a conference, and there was a gentleman who came up to me afterwards and said, "Oh, you have to write a book." And I gave him the standard "I'll never write a book" type line. But he said something to me that stuck with me, and I couldn't shake it. And he said, if there was a woman who sat outside Abraham Lincoln's office door every day for 10 years, don't you think we would want to know what she saw and observed and learned? And don't you think she would owe it to history to tell us? So I still wasn't going to write a book, but fast forward a few years ago, I was approached by Hachette Books, and just through a crazy set of circumstances that could only be divinely ordained, here's the book.
The demographics in Moore County have changed a lot. Moore County is getting younger and younger, and a lot of the millennials, a lot of the college graduates don't know a lot about Ronald Reagan and about the values and the values we grew up in. And I'm not saying I'm got many years on you, but we grew up in a system where personal responsibility, make your own way. Is this book in a way part of paying it forward to the next generation of Peggy Grandes who are getting out of college and don't know which way to look and what to do?
Yeah. I hope that it will be an inspiring portrait of what can happen when you imagine and dream and work really hard. I mean, Ronald Reagan certainly was an example of that. My publisher said something interesting during the early writing process, which resonated with me in the sense that he said, I have to tell my story alongside the president's, because most people can't relate to being president of the United States, but everybody can relate to one part or another of my story. And hopefully whoever picks it up, whether they're young and green and just stepping into their first job, will realize that everybody starts out in a place where you feel like it's unfamiliar and you wonder, will I ever find my way? Will I ever be a good contributor in a space that seems so foreign? And then through my eyes and through my story and through my perseverance, you get to a place in life where I felt like I actually could do this job and that I added value and I belonged there. And it's a wonderful feeling when you feel like you actually have made it in a place that seemed so foreign just earlier. And then I think the other lesson in the book is, near the end, you realize that life often throws us curveballs. And what do you do when that comes your way? Just when you're feeling confident in a space, life throws you something that you didn't see coming and that you don't want. And in Ronald Reagan's case, it was a diagnosis of an illness. I was very young. I was juggling a house full of young children. My father was actually facing a terminal illness as well, and Ronald Reagan was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And you wonder, do I have the capacity to endure? Do I have the capacity to serve all of those fronts with equal excellence and stamina and optimism? They all needed you to keep going and press on, but everybody faces that in life. And how will you face it?
That 10-year period from leaving Pepperdine to working with Ronald Reagan was tumultuous, as you say. But you, in your book, you go back and forth in time, and you talk a lot about your dad. And he died at a very young age, 57.
Yeah.
And
I was still in my 20s.
You were 24, 25?
29, yeah.
That's an awfully young
With two
age.
little kids. Yeah, it is.
And you were trying to do a balancing act, working for Ronald Reagan, raising young children, starting a new marriage. Those 10, and you called it, it was a calling, that 10-year period. You look at it in a perspective that it was sort of meant to be. Is that accurate?
It is. And, on paper, it maybe seems like it just would have been all chaos and all stress and very joyless. But I really look on those years as a time filled with joy. And it was challenging, certainly. There was definitely heartbreaking moments. But I believe that we can find joy even in the midst of conflict or chaos.
Right.
And sometimes those are the times when we find the most joy, because we really sift through all the external things and really focus on what matters and what's important. And you really get serious about whether it's a faith that you have or a commitment to people around you. Everything else kind of disappears, and you really drill down on that.
Talk about your observations about how Ronald Reagan lived his life every day, because it permeated throughout the entire book, and what impression it left on you.
Yeah, there was a couple of things. I think starting out working for him at such a young age, I didn't really know what leadership at its best and highest could look like. We had, our images on TV or in the movies, but, those were usually either the bosses that lorded over people, or you had your really nice people. And you didn't know that the two could coexist in one person. So here was Ronald Reagan with a spine of steel who went toe-to-toe with the Soviet Union, and yet behind the scenes was very gentlemanly and gracious and kind. And I think that kind of threw me for a loop as far as realizing that, you can have that. You can be both of those things. Ronald Reagan, for all the front of the camera gregariousness and outgoing and joke telling and storytelling, behind the scenes, people would probably be surprised to know he was fairly quiet. He was very disciplined. He was very hardworking. He very much prepared for every appointment, every speech, every visit, every trip. He was well versed on exactly what would happen and asked good questions if he was unclear on things, so that when the person walked in or we were stepping into an event, it could just appear as if it was happening seamlessly. But he was very diligent behind the scenes, and I think a lot of people underestimated that aspect of him.
I don't know a Republican or a Democrat who doesn't remember the debate he had with Walter Mondale for the 1984 election, where everybody laughed. They had can you tell that story? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I'm not a good storyteller like Ronald Reagan, but I know that they were trying to pin him into a corner and, make issue of his age.
That's
and
right.
Basically they were indicating that he was too old to be president, that, he seemed tired and needed naps and,
That's right.
all these
he was
things.
81 or 82 at the time.
Donald Trump would call it fake news. But
Right.
yes, Ronald Reagan, in his very charming, personal way, flipped it completely around. And rather than addressing the question of his advanced age, he basically said to Mondale, well, I won't let, for political purposes, my opponent exploit the youth and inexperience of my opponent. And everybody laughed, including Walter Mondale. And
Heartily,
at
he did.
that moment, if there was any doubt, that election was won by Ronald Reagan.
It was. And Walter Mondale, I remember that. Walter Mondale liked Reagan. He respected Reagan.
Yeah.
And he wasn't afraid to show it.
Yeah.
You go back to the debates we had about a year ago. Oh, my goodness. And then I recall the Republican candidates today at the Reagan Library.
Mm-hmm.
All 16 of them. You were there?
I was there. Mm-hmm.
The tone and the tenor, everybody tried to pay homage to Ronald Reagan. What was that like? What was sitting in that crowd like? Because I was uncomfortable watching it.
Yeah, it was interesting. There was a lot of camps there, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you had all your people who were in favor of one candidate or another. It's been interesting since the book came out. I guess I knew that the flag-waving patriots on the right would love the book. But I think the biggest surprise has been how embraced it's been on the left as well.
Sure.
And I would say because it's that feeling of longing for a political civility. Can we disagree without being disagreeable? Can we work together to understand the other person's point of view and listen as much as we talk? And whether you're talking about a group of candidates that are all on the right side of the aisle, or if you're talking about, a dialogue between the left and the right, it's the civility that we're lacking. And so that's been the thing I would say above anything in the book that has really resonated. And it's not about the policies and the politics of the man. It really is about the goodness of the character and the civility. And they are kind of a lost time. The timing of the book was interesting because my publisher said I want it to come out right after the election, right in that first 100 days of the inauguration. At the time I was writing, we didn't know who would be our president, but the publisher had the forethought to say, we know that it's going to be a toxic and tumultuous time, and we know we're going to need the Band-Aid of Reagan. And it really has been sort of that healing balm for the soul in a way that has soothed a lot of political incivility.
And reading the book is very peaceful and very soothing. And it was a coming of age for you. And I think people who read this book will hearken back to a time of that civility, and I think the time is right to do that. Let's come back in the second set because I want to talk, you mentioned the world leaders, and I want to talk about some of the stories you told about Ronald Reagan with Brian Mulroney, Gorbachev, Mother Teresa, people who came in to see him after his presidency and what the byproduct of his presidency did to the quality of the relationships that he maintained in those 10 years. Our guest is Peggy Grande. Her book is The President Will See You Now. It's a terrific read. We're delighted she's here in Moore County. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to our second set of All Things Moore County, speaking with author Peggy Grande, who wrote the book The President Will See You Now, all about Ronald Reagan. Scott Walker wrote a brief review of the book. I just want to read it to you. Peggy Grande had a front row seat to the final years of Ronald Reagan's remarkable life. In The President Will See You Now, she shares amazing stories and renews our respect for such a remarkable leader. Peggy's insights remind us of President Reagan's eternal optimism and belief in the American people. For those who love Reagan, it is a must-read. For those who don't love Reagan, it's even more of a must-read. And I just found out today is his 107th birthday. He was born today in 1911, huh?
He was.
Huh. I had no idea. And Scott Walker's birthday as well.
It's his anniversary.
It's his anniversary. Yeah. You talk in the book about how Ronald Reagan spoke to the American people, not at them, not past them. And it was one of his best gifts.
I think the people responded to him because they felt like he was speaking directly to them, not above them in a preachy way and not beneath them in a belittling, demeaning way, but actually spoke directly to them. And that was on his heart all the time, wishing to communicate. Before the day of social media, he would have the weekly radio addresses. He would call the cameras into the Oval Office and look through the lens of the camera and come onto one of your 3 networks at home with your little dial TV. But he wanted to be able to communicate directly with the American people. That was important to him. And the language he chose and the way in which he spoke to people was very important and very strategic and thought out on his part.
If he were alive today and he was in his prime, what would he make of our news environment, our media, our social media environment? How would have changed him?
Well, I think he would have been engaged. You know, he probably would have been on Twitter. He was the king of one-liners anyway. I mean, can you imagine his Twitter feed?
Yeah.
It would have been amazing. Everybody would have followed him.
Right.
You know, times were very different. I have to believe that if Ronald Reagan were still involved in the political arena, that the political arena would be very different, because he had a way of turning the conversation around, and he had a way of elevating things to a place of greater civility and greater graciousness. And so even the people who disagreed with him politically couldn't help but like him personally. And so I just can't imagine anybody ever having the spatting we see going on with Ronald Reagan, because he was a gentleman.
Yeah.
He treated people that way, and people responded.
Tell me about some of the relationships he had with some of the world leaders after his presidency that you got to, as his photographer, got to see firsthand.
Yeah. So not only having a front row seat to his remarkable life day in and day out in the office, I mean, that was amazing. But then being the ultimate fly on the wall in some of these appointments with world leaders. You know, we wonder how we get photos of private meetings. Well, when everybody leaves the room, the photographer gets to stay. So being in the room post-presidency with President Reagan as he met with Margaret Thatcher and Mother Teresa and Gorbachev and Lech Walesa and Prime Minister Mulrooney and Prime Minister Nakasone and the King of Jordan, and I mean, pretty much anybody and everybody came through the office. And the interesting thing about that is that post-presidency, there was no reason for them to come through for diplomatic reasons or protocol reasons. They came because they wanted to. They had a relationship with him that had started in the White House. Some had started even before that they wanted to see continued. And it was a time that diplomacy was very relational. It wasn't based on rhetoric, and it wasn't political. It was very personal. And Ronald Reagan's version of diplomacy is something I think we can all still learn from today.
Mm-hmm. You told a story about the ranch and Gorbachev.
Mm-hmm.
When they came over to visit the Reagans. I'd love you to hear a Cliff Notes version of that story.
Well, back in the day, things weren't quite as simple as they are now. You can go on the internet and Google just about anything. And so we were in a staff meeting. We were planning for the upcoming visit of Gorbachev and his wife. And there was going to be a formal ceremony up at the Reagan Library. And then they were also going to pay an informal visit up to the ranch. And so Ronald Reagan decided that he wanted to present Gorbachev with a gift. And the gift we thought would be appropriate. He wanted to give him a cowboy hat to present him up at the ranch to wear. So it sounds very straightforward and easy enough until that task was assigned to me, and I realized I didn't know what Gorbachev's hat size was. And as you know, cowboy hats, along with other forms of hats, need to be fitted appropriately. Otherwise, they're going to sit up too tall on the head, or they're going to drop down over their eyes. And you can't exactly guess Gorbachev's hat size by looking at him. So it turned into literally a worldwide quest, trying to figure out what size hat Gorbachev had. And it involved staying late into the night. 10 o'clock at night, I'd be in the office calling Moscow at 8 o'clock in the morning, hoping and praying I'd find somebody who spoke enough English, sending over faxes with hand-drawn pictures of a cowboy hat and the hat ring in the middle with a question mark and an arrow. And so thankfully, at one point, I finally did get a number. It didn't sound like any sort of hat size we had here, and so then I had to figure out how to convert Russian hat sizes to Western hat sizes. Finally got that number, went and found a cowboy hat, which is not easy to do in Southern California. And thankfully, when Gorbachev put the hat on up at the ranch, the hat fit perfectly. So
You were very resourceful. You describe yourself in the book as a fixer, as a doer. You created, you were an initiator, not a reactor.
Yeah.
And that's a gift.
It was an important part of the job because it would have been so easy to be lost in the moment. And there certainly were those moments, especially moments riding in the back of the car and Secret Services driving or in some sort of either large or small motorcade, depending on the situation. And I would just turn and look over, and I'm riding in the backseat of a Secret Service driven car in a motorcade. with Ronald Reagan, and those pinch me moments of how did this happen? How did I wind up being here?
Right.
But then in the back of my head in those moments was always thinking 10 steps ahead. Okay, so when we stop, we're meeting this person. We got to have that. He needs to be holding this. I need to be holding this because he's going to need it later, and thinking through the next 10 steps. So as much as I wanted to savor every moment, I really didn't have the luxury of that and had to always be anticipating, thinking ahead, knowing where we were going next. And those steps better be in the right direction because he sure had a lot of people following him.
Mm-hmm. You wrote something in the book. Your legacy is not written after you are gone, but with every single day of your life. In other words, how you live your life every day. That was one of the lessons you took from Ronald Reagan.
Yeah. Not something that he never gave me a list of here's the things you need to learn from me, but that was something that was profound in his actions, just in the sense that he wasn't consumed by what people would say about him after he was gone. He was much more concerned about how he was living his life every single day. And writing the book was my chance to tell my story, but the rewarding part of it has been I've been the recipient of hundreds, if not thousands, of stories from other people who have told me their story of meeting Ronald Reagan. And whether it was a casual meeting, they walked past him, and they all tell me exactly the same thing. He stopped, he looked me in the eye, he connected with me, he shook my hand, and I felt for that moment that I was the most important person in the world to him. And they were, because that was genuine. That was how he lived his life. And so I think we see the outpouring that came after he passed away because he had cared about people during his lifetime.
Right.
And they knew that and they felt that. My own kids, kids don't care about titles. They don't care if you were the president or the king or anything. They know, they're very intuitive and perceptive, and they know whether somebody likes them or not.
Right.
My kids loved President Reagan because they knew that he loved them.
He had a very, very strong faith, didn't he?
He did.
And it just it permeated through everything that he did and how he treated people.
Yeah. There was a sense of peace and calm about him in everything. And certainly we were in demanding, stressful situations. I mean, you think of his job and his life, how it could have just been this stressful adrenaline rush all the time. But in the midst of a lot of activity and a lot of pressure, there was always this sense of peace and calm. And I think that had to have come from his faith and just knowing that he was called to live this life and he was going to live it to the best of his ability, and that was all that he could do.
And as somebody as principled as him, is easy to model yourself after because it's consistent.
Yeah. Yeah.
It doesn't matter whether
there was
he's
a
president or not.
predictability about him,
Right.
100 people would call the office and 99 of them would get me. But I pretty much knew, I'm sorry to disappoint them, but I pretty much knew what he would say and how he would respond if he was able to answer that question himself or if he was able to talk to that person himself. And so that's always what I tried to do. What would he have said or done, or how would he have treated this person had he had the opportunity to?
You were very taken by not just Ronald Reagan, but by Nancy Reagan and their the way they related to children. That was important to you.
Yeah.
And your children, not specifically, but absolutely, your children they wanted to share. They wanted to be around the presence of younger kids.
Yeah. And they loved my kids and were so gracious to them. And even, looking at me working for the president, I got married and had 3 of my 4 children while I was working for the president. And this was back in the day when there were no mandates or laws that said they had to save my job or let me come back or adjust when I needed to for the kids. And so I was always very appreciative and grateful that they invested and took a chance on this young woman who was juggling a lot. But they knew that I would always tell them the truth, and they knew that I was very loyal, and those were the things that really mattered to them.
We have so many young moms living in Moore County that have 2 and 3 children, all under the ages of 9.
Yeah.
And they are mothers, they're wives. Many of them are in our real estate business. I am in awe. I don't know how they can manage everything, but there's so much that's asked of them, and it's. In your 20s, did you think you were living a frenetic schedule?
Yeah.
You look back now, how do you look back on it and reflect?
Yeah, it's surprising because actually when I was writing the book, I was kind of looking at the timeline of a lot of things, and there were so many things that were overlaid, and I did have several little kids. I was married.
Right.
I had the president, and once his Alzheimer's diagnosis came through, that was an additional stress. In the meantime, my own father was dying of a long, extended illness with cancer. And so there was a lot of things that could have really sapped the joy of youth. And yet I look back, and it was such a joyful time.
Mm-hmm.
It was a busy time. And I try to really paint a very transparent picture in the book of, things weren't always perfect, but that's okay. You can find joy in the midst of chaos. You can find in yourself a strength that you never imagined you had, and you can look back on something even so demanding and stressful that stretches you. You think to your breaking point,
Right.
And be proud of the fact you didn't break and you did it with excellence.
I have 6 very classy young ladies who work with me. I'm going to make sure they read your book. Peggy Grande is our guest. The book is The President Will See You Now, a lot of life lessons and a lot of remembrances about somebody whose civility is sorely missed in our day and age today. We'll be right back. Welcome back to our final set. The President Will See You Now is the book. Peggy Grande is the author. Very articulate, fascinating book, great read. I see that it's in paperback now, so that is good news.
That came out today, hot off the presses.
Is that right?
You had an advance copy.
And, and an autograph to boot. I was wrapped into so many of the stories that you told in the book about Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan. In particular, their relationship.
Mm-hmm.
It was solid, strong, and consistent, wasn't it?
It was. They had a beautiful relationship, and people saw the doughy-eyed look that she would give him while the cameras were rolling, and that's actually how she looked at him all the time.
That's amazing.
That wasn't just on stage. But what I loved is he had that starstruck look that he gave her too, and he would just look down at her with such a sense of pride and genuine love on his face. They could not be in the same room and be on opposite ends of the room without eventually kind of finding their way back together to the same side. It was almost like magnets having to be drawn together. And they were never just standing side by side. He was always holding her hand, or he had his arm around her waist. And there was just such a sincere sweetness to their relationship. It was funny because working in the office, every now and then you would, walk into the outer hallway or something, and you'd walk in on the two of them out there hugging and kissing. And
really kissing is what you said
like
in the book.
Actually kissing, not just a little peck on the cheek. And Secret Service, who was posted there, kind of back turned, eyes rolled, kind of laughing like, yeah, well, what are you going to do?
But, it's refreshing to know that two people like that could be so equally grounded.
Yeah.
And because when you're grounded, you don't have to shout. You can be quiet. People will come to you.
Yeah. And you think of all they went through together and how that made them stronger and bonded them together even further instead of driving them apart. And so often conflict or challenges that come into a relationship from the outside drive a wedge. And instead, I think it sort of fortified them together even more. It was them against the world. And Mrs. Reagan was unafraid to be the bad guy so that he could be the good guy. And their relationship was just so interesting in that I don't think he ever would have gotten to where he did without her.
Tell me about your relationship with Mrs. Reagan.
Yeah, you can imagine a young woman in the office not knowing how her place would be with Mrs. Reagan, but I learned early on that there were a couple of key things that were really important to Nancy Reagan. You had to tell her the truth, always, fully and completely, and she wanted to know that you were loyal, and she knew from day one that I had no agenda other than to serve her husband with the best of my abilities, with excellence and efficiency, and that I would always be loyal to him and to her, and would always tell her the truth. And sometimes that took some funny turns. I don't know if you remember in the book the story about the sweater. There was one particular day, Nancy Reagan and I had many serious conversations, but we also had conversations that went a little bit like this. The president came up to the office one day wearing a bright orange like orange sherbet colored cardigan sweater. And while it would be perfect for the golf course here in the summertime, it wasn't necessarily presidential. And I took it upon myself to decide that he should not wear that to the office again. So I picked up the phone. I called Mrs. Reagan and said, Mrs. Reagan, did you see your husband before he left for work today? And she said, no, why? And I said, oh, you'll know when he gets home. And I think she knew because she said, do I need to make something disappear? And I said, yes, you do. And you will have no trouble knowing which item you need to make disappear. So a couple hours later, after the president had gotten home, she called me, and it was almost like this covert mission. And she leans in and she says, it's done. It's gone. So I don't know who wound up with his orange sherbet sweater at the secondhand shop, but some lucky soul.
You remind me of, in Chapter 10, you wrote, it's called The Painting of Rock River. It sounds like the way you dealt with that situation, you had picked up a little bit of Nancy Reagan's cues on how to converse with Ronald Reagan and get him from here to there. Can you tell that story?
Yeah,
it was a touching chapter.
I kind of got my way without him necessarily knowing. So he loved people coming in from his Midwest hometown. And so this one particular day, a man came from Dixon, Illinois, which is where he had grown up. And the man had painted a picture of the Rock River and the president by it. And so the Rock River is where the president was a lifeguard for 7 summers. And it just was a place that evoked such fond memories for him. And so I knew that this would be a long appointment. I gave them a little bit of time and space. But at the end of the meeting, I walked the gentleman to the front and left the painting with the president. Well, typically we would take the paintings and we would catalog them and send them up to the library to be part of the archive facility up there. But when I got back to the office, I realized that the president had an entirely different plan for this painting and had taken the priceless piece of art that was behind his desk, removed it from the wall, and hung this other painting on that hook. And while it was a lovely, sort of sentimental painting, it wasn't necessarily something that should have been in the background of every presidential portrait. So I went into full panic mode, not knowing exactly how I could tell this man no, he couldn't hang that picture on his wall, but knowing that it had to be moved. So I came up with a little plan, and I walked into the president's office and I said, I love that painting and I can see why you like it, but from where you're sitting, every time you want to look at it, you have to stop what you're doing and crane your neck and turn your chair to be able to see it. I said, don't you think if we put it on the other side of the office over here, and I walked over to the other side of the office, that then you could see it anytime you wanted to. So I think he was a little skeptical at first, but he kind of looked at both locations and he decided that actually maybe that was a better placement for it. So I went and got a nail and hung that on the wall. And then I said, but Mr. President, you have to help me put this painting back up because we are going to be in trouble for having moved it. So he and I, on both ends of this painting, put it over back on the wall, and nobody ever knew, I don't think, until the book came out, and now everybody knows.
I think at that time you probably received your master's degree.
In diplomacy.
Yeah, in diplomacy and how to manage situations and have a positive outcome. You said something in the book, when you communicated with Nancy Reagan, you said it was easier sometimes to express yourself in writing than it was in person. Could you explain that?
I think, that particular passage is talking about in the later years. There was so much I admired about Mrs. Reagan as far as how she just served her husband so loyally and faithfully, and especially in those more difficult Alzheimer's years where she took on the burden of caretaker. And she also, in a lot of ways, was the cheerleader and setting the example for all of us in the office on how to handle the difficult situation. And so it was sometimes hard to express that to her. So I realized I didn't know how many people in her life were still providing her support and encouragement as she was supporting and encouraging those of us in the office. So I would drop her little notes fairly often and say the things that maybe I didn't feel comfortable saying to her at the time.
One of the special parts of your relationship with Ronald Reagan was not just your husband Greg's relationship with him, but your children as well. And it almost sounded like it was 25 years worth of experience going back and forth, but it was not. It was all within 8 years?
10 years.
10 years.
Yeah.
Your husband was called to play golf with Ronald Reagan. at one time. How did that all come about?
You can imagine that phone call. So I was used to President or Mrs. Reagan calling the home in the evening to ask about a scheduling question or clarify something during the day. But Mrs. Reagan called one evening and asked for my husband, Greg. So I was a little confused why she was calling to ask for Greg, but I handed the phone over, and Greg talked with her for a few minutes. And when he hung up, he said, "Oh, the president needs a fourth for golf on Saturday." She asked me if I would play. And so, of course, I told her yes. And then he turned to me in his little sarcastic way and said, "I really was looking forward to mowing the lawn, and I really want to do the honeydew chores
and do the
on
garage.
Saturday, but duty calls. I must serve my country. I must play golf with the president."
And he was in his 20s at the time.
He was, and he got to play golf with the president regularly for the next several years, and what a great experience for him to get out on the golf course where it was just the boys, and he would come home with some funny stories and funny jokes, and I think, "The president told you that?" But he was such a gentleman. He never would have maybe told a joke like that or said something like that in front of a woman. But when it was the guys out on the golf course, they certainly had a good time.
And the president and Mrs. Reagan had your children over from time to time, and you would stress, but it all worked out well, and the kids got a chance to get to know them almost as pseudo-grandparents.
Yeah. They had wonderful grandparents of their own, but they certainly respected these people as a very important part of their life. There was definitely a formality about the Reagans, but they also had this warmth and familiarity about them too. And I loved taking the kids up there because I wanted them to have the experience and to feel connected to the Reagans. But you have to imagine how nerve-wracking it was taking a bunch of little toddlers into their beautiful museum quality home. Fortunately, we never had any big incidents, but they swam in the president's pool and would go to the beach or the golf, out to the zoo with the president. Lots of birthdays and special occasions celebrated up in the office as well.
You talked about your husband's last round of golf with the president, and it ushered in a transition where he physically wasn't able to. I guess in 1994, he had, was it 94 when he was first diagnosed with Alzheimer's?
Yeah.
And you helped him with the letter that he wrote to the American people when he informed them. It started a whole new transition.
Yeah, he wrote that beautiful letter to the American people. And, like we discussed earlier, it was really important for him to always speak directly to people. And so this beautiful, heartfelt letter that begins, "My fellow Americans," kind of ushered us all through what was coming and gave us peace and hope and strength for what would be surely ahead. And none of us really knew what was ahead. Alzheimer's was fairly unknown at that time. There were a lot of people that suffered with it, but there wasn't a lot of attention on it. In fact, there were very little, if any, resources that I could get my hands on at the time. So even though we had a name and a diagnosis, there wasn't really a roadmap for how to do that. The Reagans, in their typical way, they could have ridden off to the sunset at the ranch, and people could have speculated, but they never maybe would have had to go public with it. But that was just not who they were. And so we have them to thank for so much of the research and so much of the medications and advancements that are coming out are because they were willing to take something very private and make it very public in a way that would help other people.
And by the time that diagnosis came out, you had become very close to the president, and you actually had meetings with him and sat down, and you had conversations about, future plans and, at the end of our life. And that was a little bit of a delicate dance, wasn't it?
Yeah. I mean, nobody really wants to talk about their own funeral. And you talk about an awkward conversation, walking into the president's office, "Mr. President, I'd like to talk about your funeral." But every president, every first lady has a plan in place. And as we all know from our own personal lives too, those plans adjust and change over time. And so it was important to periodically check in and just make sure that what the plans were still reflected his wishes and what he wanted to happen at the end. And for anybody who watched the beautiful tributes that came at the end, I think it was a great reflection of a life well lived.
And you talked about, at the funeral in '04, the reality that the planning that you had done with him back in the mid-'90s had now come to fruition, and all the guests at the funeral had a program that you had a very, very large part in crafting. Did it hit you at that point? Or, that you made a difference. You made a difference.
Well, I think the overwhelming feeling was that his wishes had been followed. And so I worked for him for 10 years from 89 to 99. In 1999, he basically left the public eye, but he lived for another 5 years. And so I was able during those 5 years to go up to the home and to visit with him. And as you know, there's some very heart-wrenching stories from those final years up at his home and visiting him. So I was a little unplugged as far as the administrative aspects of the office during the last 5 years of his life. I did go back and work full-time for that last week of the funeral, but wasn't directly involved with the printer or anything like that. And so there was this moment finally at the end of the week when I sat down at the funeral and pulled the program from under my chair and realized it was the very programs that he and I had worked on together. And I hadn't thought about them for many, many years, but was taken right back into his office and was there again with him and having that warm and wonderful, although difficult conversation with him. And just that feeling of satisfaction, like his wishes were followed to the end. And it was such a beautiful service. And as difficult as it was, he was truly honored all the way to the end and had lived a grateful life.
Today, what can our younger generation get from this book? The President Will See You Now. What lessons?
You know, I think there's a couple of things. I hope that they will find inspiration, that anything is possible in America, and that you can be an ordinary person and be called into an extraordinary place. And even though it seems big and foreign, that you can find your way and find your footing and add value and make a difference. I hope that people will find that, life throws you curveballs, and how you hit them is very important. And Ronald Reagan was a great model of taking something that was incredibly difficult and facing it with faith, with continued optimism, and really a patriotic belief that America's best days were still yet ahead, and that even though much of his life was behind him, that America's story still goes on, and we can all be important and valuable contributors to that story. And I hope that people will find their own Only in America story and take whatever pieces of their life that they've been given and turn it into something beautiful and wonderful. Ronald Reagan didn't give us a blueprint that we need to follow exactly, but he certainly gave us an inspiring example of how you can come from nothing and become anything you dare to dream and believe.
The President Will See You Now is as much a story about Ronald Reagan as it is about you. And in the book, your children were all young. Bring us up to date. Where are they today?
Well, they range from 16 to 24. My son just got married to a lovely young lady we love and are so happy to welcome into the family. I've got daughters in college from the Potomac to the Pacific. I've got one still in high school, so still got lots of plates in the air that I'm juggling, but I love it. I'm so grateful for their support. My husband, Greg, has just been such a saint to ride this crazy ride with me all these years. I never fathomed all those years ago when I stepped onto the 34th floor for the first time that it would change my life forever. And because he changed my life forever, I feel this great sense of stewardship that I need to give back and share everything that I learned and experienced. And the book is certainly one way that I'm doing that.
The great thing about our lives is that we have many chapters.
We do.
And we have the more, as we go along, the chapters we keep adding on become richer in texture.
Mm-hmm.
And that paying forward aspect of it is absolutely in this book.
Yeah.
So I hope everybody reads it. Wish you luck at I'm sure you'll enjoy the dinner this evening.
Thank you.
And we want people to read the book, The President Will See You Now. I know you have a book signing over at the Country Bookshop.
I do.
And a full Moore County Blitz.
And I'll leave some signed copies of the book there if
Yeah.
anybody wants to pick them up later. I'm also on social media, Peggy_Grande, Instagram, Twitter. I'm on Facebook. The President Will See You Now, Peggy Grande. Would love to hear your stories from your listeners of their interactions and thoughts and reflections on Ronald Reagan, his life, his legacy, and his leadership.
Great book. It's a privilege to do what I do, and it's a privilege to meet you. I loved the book.
Thank you.
I wish you all the very best, Peggy Grande.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening, and I do hope that people get out and read this book. It will slow you up, take your breath away, and read about a coming-of-age story as well as memories that we should never lose. This is All Things Moore County. Have a great week.
Eyes have seen